Hello! The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner by Alan Sillitoe. First and foremost, this book was sent to me by Travis. Travis, thank you very much for sending me this book. I enjoyed it very much and it came at a good time for me. I've had a couple of disappointing reads recently, so this one really cheered me up. This is a collection of wonderful short stories. The first one is the eponymous The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner. I think if I read you this author's bio of Alan Sillitoe, it will give you some hint about what kind of short stories you should be prepared for when you read this collection. Alan Sillitoe was born in 1928, the son of a tannery worker. He left school at the age of 14 to work in a factory. He was one of the working-class novelists who revitalized British fiction in the 1950s. His first novel, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, 1958, was followed up by the best-selling collection of stories, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner in 1959. It's the outlaw against the in-law every time in these tales of English city's grimy lower depths. The streets are dark with soot, the hammer of factories could knock your brains out, there's never enough money and often no overcoat for the winter cold. So when the urchin, the criminal, the Borstal boys challenge the mucky system that keeps them down at heel, when they come out of their loneliness and boredom and defeat with raging rebellion, you're cheering yourself hoarse on the sidelines, betting on their long-distance runner who is out to beat society all by himself. In England, there was this movement in literature and film known as the angry young man, and theater, of course. Sillitoe, with this collection of short stories, he was one of those artists who was developing this genre, I guess you might call it. And I really quite like it. Because I'm also an angry old man nowadays, but when I was younger, I was an angry young man. When a person just can't take any more, no great crisis, no great trauma, but just life has got to be too much. There's nothing to do but lash out. And even though the knowledge that it's probably going to be futile, self-destroying rather than anything positive coming from it, that's also well known, but these people, they just can't help it. They have to lash out because life has become so intolerable. The poverty, mostly the poverty, all right? The poverty has just ground them down so that they feel that they're hardly even human beings anymore. They eat the same food day in and day out. They wear the same clothes until they're rags. They see other people who have money or who have had better chances in life. And a lot of these characters, they didn't have any chance. They went to poor schools which knew that all of the children in this school were going to end up working at the factory 2 streets over. Like, there was no doubt about that. Occasionally, one child who was incredibly bright might escape from the factory system, but by and large, all of these children are going to spend their lives as students and then as factory workers. If that's not something that will make you miserable with existence, then, well, give it a try and see how long you make it. For the North American reader, there's a very important word, which is Borstal. I actually had to look it up. I thought I knew what it meant, but Borstal and Borstal boys, it's young offenders prison. In North America, or at least where I come from, we call it juvie. Juvenile detention. The first story, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner, is about a young man who is in the Borstal, letting this young man train to be a long-distance runner because the warden wants his inmate to win the trophy. They're going to have all of the prisoners of England racing this long-distance race, this prisoner's race, and he has all of his hopes pinned on this one prisoner, the main character of the story, to win. Every morning, this inmate, or juvenile detention inmate, he's let out to run 5 miles to train, to get ready for this race. And while he's running, he feels all of his thoughts getting really very clear, and he can really think about his life, what he's doing, and how he got there. How he got there is him and his buddy, they broke into a bakery and they stole the money. They stole the little cash box and they brought it home, and the police were chasing after him for weeks because they knew he'd stolen the money. Everybody knew he'd stolen the money, but they didn't have the evidence. But eventually he did get caught and he ended up going to juvenile detention. That's quite a long bit of the story too, but it's fantastic. He nearly manages to get away with it, but ends up in the prison and he's coerced into running this race. his plans for this race are what make the story very exciting to read. Because if he wins, he will feel that he's been a pawn for the warden to win this long-distance cup. But he knows that if he does win, he's only got 6 months left of his sentence. So he'll get a really cushy 6 months. But if he wins, he'll feel that he's been made into a whore, that the warden has used him for his own vanity, and he realizes this. So he thinks to himself that maybe he will actually lose this race. The tension I felt while I was reading this story, something inside me. I was just like, please win the race. Please win the race. It was so funny. Like I knew he was going to lose the race. Like I was certain of it. My hope that he would actually change his mind and go for it. Oh man, it was terrible. What does that say about my personality? I don't know. That's the first story, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. It's a long one. That's almost 70 pages. Mr. Raynor, the Schoolteacher. Wow, that's a good one. It's about this teacher who's got these young boys, and what he does is he's an old teacher, and he's got quite a steel grip on the obedience of the boys most of the time. But this teacher, for the last couple of years, he's taken to putting his stool in a position in the classroom where he could look across the street and see the girls working in the department store across the way. And he watches the girls all the time. He thinks he's being quite clever about this, but of course all the boys know it as well. And they're very pleased with it, because if the teacher's watching the girls across the road, then they get almost a free class where they can just sit and do nothing, as long as they don't act up too much. And they do act up, which that's the tension in the story. So we've got this distracted teacher. We've got these boys who are just like wild urchins, I guess. He's watching the new girl across the way in the department store, and he's, he likes to look at these girls. What can I say? Deprived so suddenly, he felt for a cigarette, but there was half an hour yet for the playtime break, and he still had to deal with the present class before he went to geography at 10 o'clock. The noise broke into him, sunk him down to reality like cold water entering a ship. They were the eldest rag mob of the school, and the most illiterate, a sea stream of 14-year-old louts, rearing to leave to start work at the factories round about. The one feasible plan was to keep them as quiet as possible for the remaining months, and then open the gates and let them free, allow them to spill out into the big wide world like the young animals they were, eager for fags and football, beer and women, and a forest of streets to roam in. The responsibility would no longer be his. Once they were packed away, with the turned pages of his register, he would have done whatever could be done with such basically unsuitable and unwilling scholars. All right, he called out in a loud, clear voice. Let's have a little quietness in this room. Take out your Bibles and open them at Exodus chapter 6. The boys, 14-year-olds, young, wild, crazy, can't wait to be done with school. The teacher, fed up. That's his job. Every year, another mob of ruffians to manage for some months before they're released into the world. And his little dream of watching the beautiful shop clerks. And he really takes a note of the girls. He's like, oh, that one, I remember her boyfriend started coming around and she left one day to get married. And another one seemed like she got pregnant and she had to go. And then I am generally not a huge fan of collections of short stories because by the same author. That's important because I find that writers tend to use the same structure. They introduce the character, they introduce a bit of a crisis, they introduce the second character who's going to come and do something with the crisis, and that's your story. And if you read a collection, I find that authors tend to use the same structure every single time. 8 to 12 short stories in a collection, that can get pretty repetitive. But not with this collection. This collection, not one of the stories outstayed their welcome, if you know what I mean. Like, even though the first story is 70 pages, it's a very long short story, it always kept moving very easily and naturally. Talks about being a prisoner and running. He talks about how he used to be a delinquent with his friend and they went on this little, trying to steal some money from one of the local businesses, how he got locked up, and now he's a prisoner and he has to run this long distance 5-mile race. The rest of the short stories in the collection are shorter, but all of them were quite fresh to me. I was happier to begin one of the new stories rather than heaving a sigh of, oh, here we go again. So that was excellent. That was a big surprise for me because I am always a bit wary of short story collections from a single author. That's just my style. I have read Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and I like this better. I like Alan Sillitoe's short stories better. Maybe it's a problem. Probably it's a problem that I wonder how much female readers are going to enjoy this because every story is about men, usually middle-aged men, sometimes younger men. 2 of the stories are about teenage boys, but it's all men. And the women in the story, there's one story about a man who lives with his mother who's very domineering, and that's the story, which is excellent. That is really a fantastic story. That is so, oh man, that'll make you smile. But the majority of the women in the story, I think 2 of them, they end up getting a punch on the head because the men are angry, and that kind of domestic violence, a little bit hard to read about in 2025. On the plus side, most of these stories take place, even though it was published in 1959, they take place between the wars, after the First World War, before the Second World War. I love that historical context because one of the stories is about a man who came back from the First World War. He doesn't have any physical scars. He's very badly shell-shocked, and nobody cared. Like if you came back from the war and you had all of your limbs and you didn't, you weren't ripped in half and you had all of your face, it was like, okay, all right, go back to work. Yeah, I'm sure it was horrible, but you're fine. Go to work and we don't want to hear about it. And that's the story of that man, that the effects of the war, the scars, they're all up here in his mind, and how he is trying to live his life in London. That's a very good story. He talks about it too. He talks about how there are those men, they have one leg, they're blind, they're deaf, they're in wheelchairs, but he's physically fine. He's not looking for any kind of handout because he was one of the lucky ones. But the devastation that the war had on him, it's really very clear in the story. Very, very good. If you're in the mood for some short stories, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. Fantastic, really. Once again, thanks, Travis. Thanks for sending it to me. All right, now we're going to have a book lottery. If you support the channel on Patreon, first of all, thank you. And thank you to all the people who are supporting me on Patreon. I really appreciate it. You guys, thanks so much. Thanks for continuing to support the channel, because I know that some people have been supporting the channel for years now. Thank you, guys. I hope you know I appreciate it, because I do. I'll mail you that. I'll mail you my book of writing, Grant Shipway, The Friend from Budapest, and Grant Shipway, The Friend from Budapest, Volume 2. I'll mail you those wherever you are, even in New Zealand. Right, Barry? Barry's my one supporter in New Zealand, and I will never forget it. So, the link is down below. So please support the channel on Patreon, because I'm poor. I spend all my money on books. All right, who's going to get it? Pam. Pam, New York City Pam. Pam of the illustrious New York City Book Club. Pam, please would you write to me at my Gmail address? You know the address, but I'll give it to you anyway. grantlovesbooks@gmail.com. Write to me and say, Grant, this is my mailing address, and I will mail you that. I'll mail you those. Tra-la-la. Thank you very much for your support, Pam. Maybe you can read that for your book club. I know it's a little bit beat up and it's not pristine. There are some people who have told me that they like their books to be nice and clean. I'm not one of those types, because I'm so rough with my books. Any book that I read was in a lot better condition before I read it. Okay, guys, if you're a fan of short stories, or you want to get a taste of that angry young man energy, maybe it's not such a great energy in today's world. Maybe today there's also quite a lot of angry young man energy. Well, you can get a taste of what it was like from a century ago, and it's worth it. Like, it led to a lot of great theater. Quite a lot of Harold Pinter's plays were this angry young man energy. I'm thinking of The Homecoming. And what's the other one? The Homecoming and not The Dumbwaiter. There's a movie of The Dumbwaiter with John Travolta doing the worst British accent you've ever heard. A lot of people complain about Keanu Reeves' British accent in Dracula, but check out The Dumbwaiter with John Travolta. My God. All right, what a distraction. Please like and subscribe. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Grant Loves Books. End the video and be quiet. I will. that can get pretty repetitive. When I'm saying this, I'm mostly thinking of the Canadian author Alice Munro, who died recently, she wrote very long short stories, and I felt that they were all so similar. There was a young girl, she lived in the backwoods of Ontario, she wanted to go to Ottawa to get a job as a secretary and maybe marry her boss. There was some problem at home, and many of those Alice Munro stories were similar in that way. And it was like every time I finished one and I began the next one in the collection, it was like, here we go again. It's kind of funny. My wife doesn't read. Sometimes I wonder what she thinks about me on the sofa with, one book after another. Like, just what does she think? Like, is she shaking her head like, God damn, that idiot and his books? Oh, well.